taps on Lake Minnetonka and has done so for some years now. And so if you've been used to going and seeing Gary on the lake in Spring Park Bay playing taps, he's moving, which sounds like that is going to be such a bummer for people. But wait, there's a twist. Hello, I'm Natalie Webster, and this is Tonka Talk, where we talk about community and connection in and around the Lake Minnetonka area. Welcome, Gary.
Thank you.
How long have you been playing taps on Lake Minnetonka?
I started going out of my boathouse and making a fool of myself in the winter of 2015. And then as I got a little better, I did it more often, moved up to the deck, and have played it at sunset almost every night since then.
If you are not familiar, like you just said, Gary goes out and he plays taps at sunset on the lake, and many people have come by boat to see him play all throughout the boating season. He's been a staple on the lake, and you've become this attraction.
It's gotten a life of its own. I would say probably in 2016, more and more boats started showing up, and I started getting messages on Facebook saying, "Where is this? What time is it?" So I put a marker in the middle of the bay, Spring Park Bay, on Google, and people started using that to find it. I recently got a message from Google saying your marker has had over 10,000 views. And so once it started to go, it got pretty busy. Then Boyd Hooper did a segment of Land of 10,000 Lakes. Somebody over at the townhomes across the lake, across the bay, put a message on Facebook and said, "We can hear taps every night." My daughter said, "That's my dad." And she contacted Carol Levin and said, "This would be an interesting story." They followed me around for a week. We were at Fort Snelling. We were at St. Mary's Cemetery in Minneapolis, a cemetery in Excelsior. And they did a segment for Memorial Day that year. My purpose in trying to publicize this activity revolves around my involvement with the method that I used to get into this. I went to a funeral of a friend of mine's dad. His name was Bud Shanks. And he was a Pacific War vet and really remarkable man. When he died, I went to his funeral, and the American Legion was there. They fired the 3 volleys. They folded and presented the flag. Some guy stood behind a tree with a recording and played a recording of taps.
Behind the tree?
Yeah, out of view, because they didn't want to make it obvious that there wasn't a real taps player, but you could tell by the tinny sound. I looked at every face in that congregation, and every face had the same message. "Oh no, how can this be?" And I was just shocked. I was looking forward to that. I think people do. On the way home, I just started searching the internet and looking at what the heck. I had never played a horn. I had never read a note.
Now, wait a minute. I have to stop you.
Yes.
So when you went to that funeral and you saw this,
Yes.
and the person's behind the tree playing taps, you had never played a horn before.
I had never had a horn in my hand, ever. I always loved music. I went out for the church choir in junior high school and got laughed off the stage. I couldn't carry a note. Written music was just a foreign language to me. I started looking at it. My next door neighbor, Bruce Hedblum, was for 20 years the conductor of the 451st Army Band at Fort Snelling. And he had been a horn player, and they were very good friends right next door. And I went to Bruce and Carol and I said, "Could a guy learn to do this? This is just horrible." And he said, "It's not easy to learn to play a horn if you've never played. If you didn't start as a kid, it's hard. You could." So I went to Minnetonka Music. I talked to Bob Bushnell there. He said he'd give me lessons and teach me to play taps. And I bought a bugle. It was $80. I still have it. It had a horrible, tight little mouthpiece. It was very difficult to play, but got to where I could cruddle through. It wasn't good. And then one day I thought, well, I'm going to see what it's like to play outdoors. And so I went outdoors, and it was awful. But ahead of all of this, on the way home, we found this organization that this guy had also been on the news. His name was Tom Day, who in 2000 or 2001, when the Department of Defense said, we no longer can even pretend that we can supply buglers for veterans' funerals when they die. It just isn't possible. So here's a recording on a CD. Here's a fake horn with a little speaker in it. You can use that. And Tom, who was a retired Marine and played at the National Cemetery in Chicago a lot, went to General Westmoreland and said, can I put together buglers? And he said, have at it. And so he took a Boy Scout and a friend of his, and they started an organization that today has, I think, between 2,500 and 3,000 active buglers. The number changes because people come on and they're not active, but it's the largest active bugle corps in the world.
And what is the name of the organization?
It's called Bugles Across America,
Okay.
and the website is www.buglesacrossamerica.org. And so I had a mentor there, Tom Mays, who talked me through buzzing in the car with a mouthpiece and becoming a better horn player. And I learned on that bugle to play taps pretty darn well. And I booked my first funeral. It was in Excelsior. I was terrified. It went really well. It was such a euphoric feeling to drive home and think of the faces of those people who were standing there listening to a grateful nation say goodbye in the most official way that they can. This is a magical piece of music. It means nothing else except goodbye and thank you. The history of it is amazing. It started during the Civil War, where there were so many bodies. More Americans died in the Civil War than all the wars since. And there were bodies everywhere. And the media was hammering the president about it. And he told them to do something. And a fellow by the name of Colonel Butterworth took an old British tune that was used at the end of day. They would play that tune, and that was a signal for the bars to close the taps. The soldiers had to come back to the barracks. And that's how it got its name, taps.
For the bars to close the taps. Are you
beer taps?
Oh, get out!
They're drinking. Yeah, that's the actual
So the soldiers
story.
are all out drinking,
Yes.
and that signaled that.
Yes, and that started like in the
Last call.
1680s when that tune was used. This guy had, because he was a bugler in the Civil War and in all the wars up until World War. Actually, they did in World War I also until World War II. Bugles were used for field commands: flank to the right, flank to the left, advance, retreat, artillery. They still have different bugle calls for all of those things. So Butterworth took that, put it in a lower key, slowed it down, changed a few notes, and made taps. He played it for his commanding officer, who said, because when they would go out to pick up their dead, they'd get shot at. And so he went out on his horse, stopped in the middle. They were shooting at him. He started playing taps over the bodies, and they stopped shooting. They came out, got their dead, brought them back, and then the Confederates came up. Their bugler played taps, and they took theirs off. And ever since then, it has been the tribute to fallen veterans.
I had no idea that, one, that's why it's called taps, and secondly, that is even how it started.
Yeah,
That's
interesting
fascinating.
Story. Yeah. And Arlington Cemetery, where it is played the most, where the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier is, was the plantation owned by Robert E. Lee before the war. And they made it the national cemetery so that he could never reclaim it. What Bugles Across America gave me was an entree into the services, because on my own, I was going through the newspaper and it would have a little flag that says veteran. And so I'd call and say, do they have a live taps player? And they would say, I don't know. The VFW is coming. I said, would you check with them?
Yeah.
Most of the time they didn't. I never served. When I was in high school, my dad was in World War II, fought all across Europe, as did my wife's dad. They both were in action. My wife's dad talking about kids who were starving, who were scavenging for food. My dad talking about being lost with his troop and not knowing whether they were behind enemy lines or not. And they ran out of food, and they got to a farm, and they snuck up on the farm to see if there were any Germans there. And there weren't. There was no one around, but there was a chicken running around. And he said they had this hilarious thing, these soldiers chasing this chicken. He said finally he just laid down on the ground and shot its head off. And they cleaned it and boiled it up in his helmet. And he said that was the best chicken I ever ate in my life. I just assumed, because my dad was in the war, that I would be. The Vietnam War was screaming in 1969 when I was getting out of college. And so I just thought, okay, I'll go. I was a football player in college. Yeah, I'm going to be running across some field and getting wiped out. It's just I already had 3 friends who had been killed in Vietnam. So that was the future I looked at. And so I thought, I've been dating the same girl for 2 years. I got married the same day I graduated from college. Graduation was 11:30 in the morning, and I got married at 6:30 in the afternoon. That was almost 54 years ago.
Wow!
Yeah.
Congratulations!
And went back to my hometown and went to work, waiting to get drafted. Collapsed at work, I had a duodenal ulcer. Never knew what that was. A couple weeks later, I get a draft card that says you're a 4F, ineligible for the draft.
Because of the medical condition.
Because of the medical condition. And I thought, wow, now I have to plan the rest of my life. It all started to change very rapidly. In 1980, along with a friend of mine, Leighton Zellman, had $1,000 that I got from an old boat that I sold. I lived on Phelps Island. And we started a company from nothing and just lived the American dream. That company grew very rapidly. By 1999, it's because of the freedoms that we have, that my dad, my wife's dad, all the guys who went to Desert Storm, all those soldiers who answered the call, and I didn't. So Bugles Across America was just, there are things that happen in your life you don't plan. You look back on it 30, 40 years later and you go, wow, how did I meet her? How did I get that job? How did I decide to go there? You just make it work out. Bugles Across America was the same way. When I talked to Tom Day, he said, you'll never feel about anything the way you feel walking away from these funerals. That you have provided something not just for the people who are there to say goodbye, but for the person that they're saying goodbye to.
And you found that to be true.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I have played for significant veterans. A guy in Watertown, Speed Holman, who was a D-Day veteran on 5th of June that year, parachuted in behind enemy lines. Everybody got scattered in all directions. He had no idea where he was. They finally got their unit together and they fought in the hedgerows for 3 weeks. And then they flew them back to England and they trained for 3 more months, I think. I don't remember the time gap, but then did a daylight parachute drop into Holland in what was called Operation Market Garden. And that was a disaster. They lost a lot of people in that, and the battle was much more difficult and probably not well planned. But he got knocked out bailing out of the plane. When he landed, he was captured immediately by the Germans. He spent 5 months in 3 different stalags. Then they were liberated by a column of Russian tanks that had a woman commander who said, you 3 Americans, you can go with us to Berlin, or if you don't want to, you can head east. And they did not want to fight under the command of Russians. And so they walked east all the way across Poland to Warsaw. They took a train from Warsaw to Istanbul, Turkey, then a boat from Istanbul to Port Said, Egypt, another boat to Naples, where they turned themselves in at 85 pounds to American MPs. Watertown and the 3 towns around them shut down. There were hundreds of people at his funeral. I stood in the middle of the street and played taps to this column. It was absolutely spectacular.
Wow.
There was a guy named Sleacy who was killed in January of 1950 in Korea. And they had identified his remains through DNA. That was one of the days. It was in the wintertime when there were a lot of snowbirds in the Bugle Corps at Fort Snelling, and they didn't have somebody that day, and they didn't want to use recordings, so they called me, and I got to play for that guy. Private first class, lowest level rank you can have in the Army, and 3 generals at his funeral.
Wow.
Spectacular. And then on the opposite end of the spectrum, I've had a number of funerals where there's the deceased, and someone from the funeral home, a preacher, and myself. Mostly World War II vets. They're all around 100 or over 100 years old. And some of them, they're the last in their family tree. There is no one, or there's no one local who could get here. And those are extremely emotional. I will stay. I'll pray with them, so there's somebody there for that. But it's very significant to me because I'm there representing everyone else in the country. That guy's not going alone. And he's hearing that gratitude through this magical piece of music. It's really, really an interesting thing. I very often stay at those until after everyone's gone.
Bugles Across America, now that you're working with them, they're able to connect you. You don't have to go through the paper anymore.
Exactly.
They are connecting you with families, and you travel as well. You've gone out of state to play the bugle, to play tap.
I'm the state director, so we have 185 active buglers in the state of Minnesota, but my responsibility is 100 miles from the Twin Cities, which gets us all the way to Eau Claire. and down into northern Iowa. People can go to our website if a veteran dies and request a bugler. Once you do that, an email goes out to all of the buglers within 100 miles of that mission, we call them. And the first bugler to say, I'll take that mission, gets the detailed information, contacts the requester, and says, I will be there. Even if they have a VFW and they were going to use a recording, our bugler will show up, and we're always early and coordinate with the commander of the Corps who's going to do the ceremony. Or very often, I'll just get a call and they say, it's winter time, we just want someone to play taps and present a flag at the church. I'll do that. Sometimes there are circumstances where they're just going to have a celebration of life and they would like someone there to play taps. There's never a charge. We'll always do a very credible job. 2 years ago, on the 4th of July, we always have 100 boats in the bay. It just fills up. I put a thing on Facebook and said, my other grandson, Jack, who plays in the jazz band at Minnetonka High School, is going to play echo taps with us. And the day before, he calls me up.
And for echo taps, for people who don't know, can
Yes.
you explain a little bit about what that is?
Yes, echo taps is a ceremonial playing of taps that's not approved for funerals. So we don't do that for funerals, but for things like the 4th of July. It's a counterverse of taps.
They do this on the 4th of July.
On the 4th of July. Calls me the day before and he said, remember my friend Mike that was at my house last week? And I said, yeah. And he said, he got killed this afternoon in a jet ski accident. And 15 years old. And Jack's crying and he said, taps is so sad, Grandpa, I can't do it. And I said, don't worry. And so I put a thing out and said, it's just going to be me. We had a really bad situation and it's just going to be me. And a woman sent me, who I only knew through playing taps and Facebook things, sent me an email that said, Gary, meet Manny, meet Gary. And I thought, okay, what's this? And next thing I know, I get an email from this guy named Manny. And he said, I'm a member of Bugles Across America. And I look in my database, by golly, there he is. And he just did a funeral last week. And he said, I'd be happy to come and stand in for your grandson. And I said, well, bring your wife. Our whole beach opens up. All the yards blend together. Spend the day. It'll be great. He and his wife, Claudette, came out, and we're sitting in the backyard, and we're having a beer, and the boats are gathering. And he said, how long have you been playing? And I tell him my story. He says, wow, that's amazing. He said, what kind of horn do you have? And I said, I have a Sonare. It's a German-made horn. And he said, oh, it's a great horn. I had one of those. And I said, well, what do you play? And he said, well, I play a Manette. Now, Manette is a custom-made horn that costs thousands and thousands of dollars. It takes a year to get one. They custom make it to the way you play.
Wow.
And I looked at him in disbelief and I said, okay, you play taps at veterans' funerals with a Manette horn? And he said, well, I'm also the principal trumpet player for the Minnesota Orchestra.
So he doesn't open with this. He's sitting on your beach.
He's been there for 2 hours. There. Yeah.
By the way.
He says, and I said, oh, man. And he said, well, let's go rehearse a little bit. And so we go in and we're playing. And I said, you sound so fantastic. And he said, yeah, he said, it's a learned thing. But he said, I started young. He said, all the way through Juilliard. And I go, oh, my God, what am I doing with this guy? And he said, well, where did you learn? And I told him what I was doing. And he said, I'll give you lessons. So for the last year and a month, I've been taking lessons from a guy who for 34 or 5 years has been the principal trumpet for the Minnesota Orchestra. He has one of the 10 greatest trumpet jobs in the world. I'm going to see him play with Wynton Marsalis. And the first thing he did was had me get a Manette mouthpiece. And it's been a fantastic journey. He still does funerals from time to time for us, which is just remarkable when you think of the schedule those guys keep. Because he teaches, he conducts and plays with the Burnsville Orchestra. He's an incredibly active person, travels all the time. Really neat. But
that is truly amazing. Yeah. And what a great, it's just such a wonderful opportunity. You've done so much for so many other people, and to have that opportunity to learn and really up your game.
When you're being taught by someone who is, you always wonder, is this right? Am I doing this right? How do I change? What do I need to change? What he tells me is unquestionably exactly the right thing to do.
You don't need to worry about it or question.
And so he really likes teaching me because I'm so empirically coachable. I'll stand on my head.
Well, that's how you've been successfully married for 54 years.
You have to ask her about that. Today, I am making some changes. We've decided that we're going to split our time between here and Florida. after 37 years, I can't remember, 1985 to now, is that 37? I think it is. We sold our house on Casco Point, and we're moving to a townhome on 3 Points.
You're not going to be in the same spot. And so if you've been used to going and seeing Gary on the lake in Spring Park Bay playing taps, he's moving, which sounds like that is going to be such a bummer for people. But wait, there's a twist.
On weekends, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday in the summertime, and probably just Friday and Saturday in the winter, I'll be coming to the yacht club and playing on their deck. There'll be a flag there. If the flag is up, I'm playing, because sometimes I got 2 kids playing high school football. I got to go to the football game on Friday night. But if the flag is up, I'm playing. You can look any time of day if the flag is there that I'm playing. If it's not there, I'm not. If you go to Taps on Casco Point on Facebook, just do a search for that. I typically post whether I'm going to be playing that night or not.
I'll share a link to that, to all of that as well. We'll share links to how you can follow Gary on social media, but also I'll share a link to Bugles Across America where you can actually donate, and your donations will go to help bugle players travel and go to these different services and be able to provide this service for so many.
I also have special requests that come to me. A couple of months ago, I had a guy who contacted me, and he said, my uncle died in Vietnam, and the guy whose arms he was in when he died has been looking for us for 60 years, and he's here, and I would love to bring him over in the boat and have you play taps for him. I had something going on that night. I wasn't going to play, but for that, I'm gonna. And I went down and met this gentleman, and I apologized for not having gone to Vietnam, and he said, you didn't miss anything. Which was an interesting comment. But those situations come up. Another one that came up last year when the evacuation was happening in Kabul, a young mother called me, and she said she and her son, who was in the Minnesota National Guard, had been to taps on the lake, but he was at Abbey Gate in the Kabul airport. And that day, 13 American soldiers and Marines had been killed. And he emailed his mom and said, see if Gary could live stream taps for us tonight.
Oh my God.
He's
killing me with these stories.
And my son came and helped me, and we set up a live stream. I named every one of the 13 who had died and played taps for them. They stayed up. It was very early in the morning in Kabul, and played taps for them. And at the end, I said, when you guys get back, come over and have a beer, which happened this summer, which was really spectacular. Fine young man, American patriot, soldier, war hero in my book. And that was one fantastic beer.
That is incredible. We're really excited here at the Yacht Club. And if you don't know, I work out of the Yacht Club. We're so excited to have Gary playing taps, to be able to do this. We've had our neighbors have been talking about it, how much they enjoy that. And so it's really going to work out great that we'll be able to do that.
I went to visit Tom Day in Chicago, and he bought the house next door to him and made it a Bugles Across America museum. And he had all kinds of memorabilia and things in there. And he was telling me that he was friends with Pappy Boyington, who was a very famous squadron commander in the Pacific War. They flew Corsairs. And he was called the Black Sheep in the 60s. There was a TV show with Robert Conrad called Baba Black Sheep. And they would do the most outlandish things, violate orders, and just hammer the enemy. And he was friends with Tom. And he showed me a telegram he got from Pappy when he was terminal with cancer. And he said, Tommy, I'm running out of runway here. You better get your horn and head for Arlington. And Tom showed me a picture he had of him playing taps at Pappy's gravesite. So I'm a watercolor artist. I did a watercolor of it. And I was going to send it to Tom to put in his little museum. And I've always been artistic. Along with that, I think that leads to how you get interested in music. But I've always written poems, always. I have books of them. And so I sat down, and this just came out of me. And I put it on the painting. They won't tell you stories of battlefield glories, show medals they stash in a drawer. Don't ask them what happened. Did you kill anybody? What was it like being in war? Don't make him recall his buddy named Paul, who was lost on the 5th of September. Don't make him re-see unspeakable things. Don't relight that smoldering ember. On his very last day, when the last volleys play, and the grateful flag lays in our laps, Goodbye, we will say, shed a tear, and we'll pray. Miss the soft, saddened echo of taps.
Oh my God.
It's one of my best. I'm pretty proud of it.
That is so good. Oh, every time I talk to Gary, I end up crying.
Had that effect on women.
That's absolutely beautiful. So you put that on the back of the painting?
On the front of it.
On the front of it.
Yes, and it's in his museum.
Wow, that's incredible.
Yeah.
That would be really neat to see. We really look forward to having you play taps.
Great. And if you live somewhere near Spring Park Bay, sound carries across the water. We've had people from Enchanted Island contact me and say, we can hear it. We can hear it on a calm day. They can pick it up. Same with Black Lake. I've got some good friends who live in Black Lake who say, we heard you tonight. And it's an interesting thing.
That's fantastic. And I'm sure that we'll have you on again if you'll come back on. Would love to chat more about everything that you're doing. So we will absolutely do this again. Thank you so much, Gary, for coming on Tonka Talk and sharing with us what you've been doing. You have so many people who appreciate this around Lake Minnetonka. And we talk a lot about community and connection and the way that people create community and connection in the Lake Minnetonka area and beyond. And Gary's a great example of that, to travel and doing these funerals, and just that acknowledgement is just beautiful, which is why I'm just a hot mess right now. It's just so touching. So having said that, we're going to leave it. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. And we will definitely